Chapter 1. Heather. I need your help. Heather's ailing mother, Caroline, called from her bedroom. I'm coming, Mother. Heather was tired. Her mother kept her busy day and night. Nothing Heather was doing could even begin to be as important as what her mother needed. When Heather got to her mother's room, she found her sitting up in bed with an annoyed expression on her face. Yes, Mother. I was just finishing up the dishes from your tea. I would like you to read to me, Heather. It has been ages since you sat down and just read me a story. Heather took a deep breath. I still need to do the laundry this afternoon, Mother. I don't think I'll have any time for reading to you. Her mother pouted. What am I supposed to do then? I'm too ill to get up for longer than a meal. Why won't you entertain me? Because I have too much to do. The doctor will be here in a few minutes to check on you, and you can talk to him. I don't like Dr. Brown, Mother said, glaring at her daughter. He never listens to me. He comes in and hurries right back out. I'm sorry. You're going to have to entertain yourself. Would you like to read to yourself? I can get your Bible for you. No, I like it when you read to me. But you also like a clean house, clean clothes, and food to eat 3, sometimes 4, times per day. I can't sit and read to you when there's work to be done. Heather was starting to think there wasn't a thing wrong with her mother other than a desire to keep Heather at her side for the rest of her life. She was definitely going to talk to Dr. Brown about her suspicions. Heather, you know you mean everything to me. Just sit with me for a short while and hold my hand. I'm sorry, Mother. You'll be ashamed if the doctor comes, and the house is in this state. Heather left her mother's bedside and put away the last of the dishes from her mother's tea. When she'd finished, she put water on to boil for the laundry that still needed to be done, then prepared supper. Her mother hated soups, but Heather thought soups were good food for invalids, so that's what she made. A huge pot of chicken and barley soup with plenty of vegetables from the garden Heather had grown with no help from her mother. She was in the yard, hanging clothes on the line a few hours later when the doctor arrived. He stopped and chatted with Heather for a moment, while she continued her work. How is she? The doctor asked. Heather bit her lip, lowering her voice because all the windows in the house were open on that hot July day. I want to know the truth, Doctor. Is my mother sick, or does she just like me waiting on her hand and foot? Dr. Brown smiled. I'm so glad you asked me that. I didn't feel like I could tell you unless you did. Your mother is fit as a fiddle. I think she's just letting you do everything because you will. You let her be sick, so she is sick. But truly? There's not a thing wrong with her. So, if I were to leave her here alone, she wouldn't starve or die because she was too sick to care for herself? Heather asked the question as frankly as she could. She was tired of being a slave to her mother's illness. She was already 27 years old. It was time for her to start a family of her own and stop taking care of her petulant mother. It would be the best thing that could possibly happen to her, the doctor said in a whisper. Now I'm going to go check on her and make sure she is all right, but I'll be surprised if I can find anything at all wrong with her. Heather bowed her head for a moment, praying for the courage to leave. She couldn't stay with her mother as her very own slave. Why slavery hadn't been legal since 1865, and she didn't think anyone, regardless of their skin color, should be a slave in these modern times. They were almost upon a new century. The doctor came out 10 minutes later after his examination, stopping to talk with Heather. She's asked me to tell you that she won't get better if you ignore her and don't read to her for at least 2 hours a day. I told you. But I'm also telling you there's not a thing to get better from. Thank you, doctor. I appreciate your candor. As Heather hung the last of the clothes on the line, she started trying to think of a way to escape her situation. She believed with all her heart that she should honor her mother, but she also thought her mother should have some respect for her, and not expect her to give up her own life to take care of her. The doctor was halfway out of the yard when he returned. "I've heard that Elizabeth Tandy is a wonderful matchmaker. She sends women out to be mail-order brides. You could go to her and be out of town before your mother had any inkling of what you were thinking of doing." Heather felt one corner of her mouth turn up in a smile. The movement felt foreign. She couldn't remember the last time she'd smiled or laughed. It seemed as if it had been years. Her father had died shortly after she turned 13 of a heart attack. Since then, her mother had expected Heather to take care of her. Knowing her father would have been against the situation gave Heather more courage than she would have otherwise had. She decided then and there she'd go into town before her mother awoke. She was going to be a mail-order bride. Anything to get away from Beckham, Massachusetts, and her controlling mother. Back in the house, she stirred supper and set the table. She wasn't going to serve her mother soup in bed, though she'd served her tea there earlier. She almost always made her walk to the table for her meals. Her mother didn't like it, but Heather kept telling her that she needed to be able to use her legs. While she waited for the soup to finish cooking, she swept the floor everywhere in the kitchen and sitting area, and then she scrubbed up the 2 footprints that could be seen on the otherwise immaculate floor. She dished up the soup and put it on the table, then called to her mother. "Supper's ready. Come eat at the table with me. You know it's hard for me to sit up long enough to eat." "I do. That's why I have everything on the table and ready." With a loud, long-suffering sigh, her mother got out of bed and walked into the kitchen, not looking a bit sick. She did walk slowly and carefully, but with as little as she moved around. Heather thought that was to be expected. "Soup? I'm tired of you making so much soup." Heather shrugged. "Chicken soup is for sick people." "You are sick, aren't you, Mother?" "You know I am." Mother plopped down in one of the chairs, staring at the soup unhappily. "If I eat soup tonight, will you make something tastier for supper tomorrow night?" "What are you thinking about?" Heather asked, not willing to agree to anything. She wouldn't lie to her mother, but she would leave and let her mother fend for herself. The doctor obviously thought that was a good idea. "A pot roast? With mashed potatoes and carrots, and maybe some onions. And gravy. Lots of gravy to serve over it." "That sounds too rich for you." "We can't risk it," Heather said. "I'm tired of eating invalid food." "Aren't you an invalid?" Her mother frowned, looking down at her lap. "Well, of course, I am. That doesn't mean I don't like good food though." "I understand," Heather said. "I guess we'll see what I feel like cooking tomorrow, and what I feel like you can handle." She paused for a moment. "I need to make a trip into the mercantile tomorrow, so I will most likely be gone when you wake up." "But what about my breakfast?" Heather wanted to tell her to get it herself, but instead, she said, "I'll leave some toast with butter out for you. That should be just what you need." Until a few weeks before, when Heather's suspicions were raised when she found her mother standing beside her bed, Heather had completely catered to her mother, making her whatever she wanted whenever she wanted it. Now that she knew her mother wasn't truly sick, Heather had no problem telling her mother she was too sick for certain things. Her mother covered Heather's hand with hers. "I wasn't going to tell you this because I don't want you worrying. The doctor told me I only have another month or 2 to live this afternoon. Don't you think I should be able to eat meals that I truly enjoy before I pass?" "I'll think about it," Heather said, smiling sweetly in the face of her jailer. "That's all I ask," her mother said, folding her hands in her lap, and looking straight at her food so she could hide a smile. "Will you read to me after supper? I need to do the dishes, bring in the laundry, fold, and iron it, and put it away. By the time I'm finished, I'll need to go to bed. You need to remember, I get up much earlier than you to see to your needs," Heather said, trying to keep her voice sugary sweet. "I don't know what I'd do without you," Mother said, gazing at her with fondness. Hester from church told me just the other day that her daughter would never care for her the way you care for me. I hope you know I'm grateful to have such a good, obedient daughter." Heather just smiled. An only child, her mother had always tried to get her to do whatever she wanted. "Have you ever thought about how wonderful it would be to have grandchildren?" "Oh, what a terrible thing to say to me. You know I won't live long enough to see you bear children." "Oh, how I wish this affliction would leave me, and I would be able to live as long as any other woman." "What is your affliction called again?" Heather asked. It was one of those long names doctors like to give everything. "If I knew what it was, I would certainly tell you." "I know you would." After supper, she did the dishes, helped her mother back to bed, and tucked her in for the night. "Sleep well," she said softly as she left the room. For the rest of the night, she folded, ironed, and put away the clothes that were out on the line. Laundry had become her job when she was just 12, because her mother had injured herself hanging something on the line. Now, Heather could do it easily, but it had been hard work when she was but 12. When all the clothes were put away, Heather made sure to turn down all the lanterns. As she changed into her night clothes, she thought about how she was going to find a man who needed a mail-order bride. In bed, she prayed for God to find her a good person to marry and that her mother would be well. Maybe her life had been hard thanks to her mother's ways, but she still didn't want her to be sick or unhappy. She just wanted a chance to live her own life for a while. The following morning, she was up early to go straight to town, buy a few things, and talk to Elizabeth Tandy about finding her a husband. Heather was certain she had a lot of love to offer, and she wouldn't even mind if her future husband already had children. She did the little shopping she needed to do first, and then arranged for everything to be delivered to her home, as she always did. And then she made the short walk to Rock Creek Road, stopping for a moment in front of the Tandy house, a little nervous about knocking on the door. She took 3 deep breaths and then forced herself up the walk to the front door, knocking loudly. A tall man with blonde hair came to the door. She'd seen him around town but had never been formally introduced. "I'm Heather Flowers. I'm here to see Elizabeth Tandy." "Yes, of course. Come in." He led her down a hall to the last door on the left, which stood open. "Elizabeth, this is Miss Flowers. She is here to see you. I'll be back with tea and cookies in a moment." "You don't have to bring cookies," Heather said. "I'm here on business." The man simply smiled at her and walked away. "Your butler calls you by your first name?" Heather asked. Elizabeth smiled. "My husband, yes." "Have a seat. I assume you're here to discuss a mail-order bride placement?" Heather sat on the couch facing the desk where Elizabeth sat. "Yes, I am. My mother, well, you don't want the whole sordid story. Suffice it to say, I'm tired of being manipulated, and I'd like to get out of my current situation. I don't care if he has children. I'm a good cook and housekeeper. There's truly nothing I won't do when it comes to the womanly arts. That will make things easier. I do have a letter that I received from a man in Clover Creek, Idaho, yesterday." Mrs. Tandy flipped through a stack of papers on her desk and presented one of the papers to Heather. "Dear potential bride. I'm a rancher living in the great new state of Idaho. I live in the country, outside of a small town that has been populated by immigrants from the Oregon Trail. I run a large cattle ranch, and I do not often make it into town to meet young ladies. I would like to find a woman to marry without having to spend the time courting her. I think it's important to say that I do live with my mother, who keeps house for me and cooks my meals. As she is getting older, she would like help with those things. She does a lot of gardening and canning, and it would give her a great deal of pleasure to teach a bride about these things if she didn't come to me knowing them. I do not wish to marry a girl who is barely out of school. I want a wife who is more mature, 25 at the youngest. She must be willing to work hard, even if she currently knows nothing about keeping house. I do not worry about looks, as they are unimportant. I am not a handsome man, but my face is not one to scare anyone either. I hope you will write me about yourself, and we can talk about whether you will fit in my family. If you would prefer to communicate by telegraph, I would be happy to do so to speed up the process a little. It is already June, and I would like to have a bride here to help my mother with harvesting and canning this autumn. Winter comes earlier here than it does in many places, and once winter sets in, we are mostly trapped in our little valley until the thaw. I hope that does not deter you. Sincerely, Patrick O'Brien. Heather looked at Mrs. Tandy. Would it be all right if we communicated by telegraph? I really would like to be out of my mother's house as soon as possible. The blonde woman nodded to Heather. Absolutely. Go ahead and write out a response. I'll send my husband to you when I have an answer. You live near the Miller farm, right? Heather nodded. Yes, how do you know? I was Elizabeth Miller before I married. Oh. You're one of the demon horde. Heather felt shocked that one of the terrible children from the Miller family would be a successful businesswoman. No, I'm one of the 4 oldest children who tried to keep all the others in check. Please, call me Elizabeth. Heather nodded, still a bit surprised. I'll write that letter now. In her letter she talked about how well she could cook, clean, and what a good gardener she was. She told him her age, which she knew would be in her favor with this man. Handing the letter over, Heather bit her lip. How long do you think it will be before I receive a response? Not too terribly long. With a letter it would be 3 or 4 weeks. I think we'll have a response from the telegraph by the end of the day. Oh, that's wonderful. Would it be silly of me to go home and begin packing today? Elizabeth shook her head. Not at all. I'll let you know as soon as I know something. I do have a good feeling about this match, though. Chapter 2. Mr. Tandy drove Heather home so he would know exactly how to get to the farm she shared with her mother. Heather thanked him and jumped down from over the wagon wheel. She knew it wasn't ladylike, but the less time he spent in their yard, the less chance her mother would see him. She hurried into the house and immediately started making lunch for her and her mother. Their only farmhand had left the milk and eggs on the work table for her, so she put the milk into the icebox and left the eggs out. When she was finished making sandwiches for herself and her mother with the bread left from the previous day, she called her mother into the kitchen to eat with her. Mother, I have our lunch ready. Her mother came out of her room, moving slowly. Where have you been? I called and called for you, and you weren't here. I told you last night I needed to do some shopping this morning. Remember? Her mother sighed dramatically. I suppose I do. But where did you put my breakfast? I put it on the stove, just like I told you I would. It's gone. You must have eaten it. All I've had were 2 cold pieces of toast. Heather smiled sweetly. Then you did find your breakfast. She pulled out her chair and sat down, waiting for her mother to sit before praying over the meal. Mother looked at the sandwich sadly. I don't like cold lunches. Heather took a deep breath before taking a large bite of her sandwich. She chewed slowly, and after swallowing, she said, But Mother, I went into town. There was no time to make something elaborate. For supper, we'll have what's left of the soup from last night. I don't want invalid food. I don't want to fix anything that will hurt you, Heather said. If you're sick, you need foods that will fortify you, but not weigh too heavily on you. What did you buy in town? Her mother asked. Some fabric for a new dress, and I got rice, beans, and more flour. Why do you need a new dress? Her mother asked, looking a bit panicked. The dresses you have are perfectly acceptable. They're acceptable if all I do is sit at home, Heather agreed. I think I'm going to start attending church again this Sunday. I've so missed worshiping with others. She hoped to not be there on Sunday, But it was much easier if she didn't tell her mother that. She didn't even think Heather should have a new dress. But who will take care of me? Mother, I left you alone for a few hours this morning. That's how long I'll leave you alone on Sunday. You're going to be just fine. Heather didn't even consider changing her mind and not becoming a mail-order bride. If it didn't work out with Patrick, there would be someone else. Staying with her mother was no longer an option. But we're still going to grow old together, right? Heather knew her mother wasn't much over 40 years old. She'd been a very young bride and had always talked about her and Heather growing old together. Heather simply smiled. The question didn't deserve an answer. Heather finished her meal and went to the sink to pump some water to wash the few dishes with. We should go for a walk this afternoon, Mother. Her mother gasped as if she'd been struck. You know I'm not up for that. A walk could kill me. All right. But I may go myself. I miss the sunshine. The only time I'm outside is if I walk to town or when I do laundry. That's not enough. She washed everything quickly, wiped the dishes, and put them away. I need you here with me. Heather looked at her mother. What do you need me to do for you? Her mother looked satisfied that they were thinking the same way again. I need you to read to me. You can read to yourself. Heather walked to her mother. Come along. I'm sure you need to get back to bed. I'll leave the Bible on the table beside your bed, and you can read all you want. Her mother walked very slowly toward her bedroom, clutching her head. Oh, no. I have a headache. You must stay with me. Get into bed, and I'll be back in an hour or two. Heather covered her mother with her quilt and left the house. She knew her mother wouldn't be happy, but at that moment, she just couldn't make herself care. When she'd been a little girl, she and her father had planted cherry trees along the road beside the house. It was a perfect time for picking cherries, and she loved the idea of making a cherry pie that evening. Maybe her mother would stop complaining if she did. While she was picking cherries, Mr. Tandy came back with a paper for her. She took it and read it. Heather, stop wiring money for a train ticket and matchmaker's fee. Stop. Please come as soon as you can. Stop. Send a telegram when train will arrive. Clover Creek. Stop. Heather grinned at Mr. Tandy. I do believe I will leave in the morning. Thank you. Mr. Tandy frowned for a moment. Has Elizabeth talked to you about the trip? No, sir. Heather wasn't sure what he meant. When you arrive, if something seems amiss, return to Beckham. If your husband ever strikes you, come back to us. We will find you a place to be, and it doesn't have to be with your mother. He glanced at the house as if he was trying hard not to be heard. Heather nodded. Thank you. Tucking the telegram into the pocket of her apron, she finished picking cherries and went inside to make the pie. While the pie was baking, and her mother was sleeping, Heather took out the pattern she used for her dresses and carefully cut out a dress from the fabric she'd purchased that morning. She could sew it on the train if it was at least cut out. It would be a long train ride, and there was no reason for her to not have something to do to occupy her hands and her mind. After cutting it out, she took the pieces into her room. She'd pin them together later to make sewing on the train easier. Then she worked on packing for the trip. She had a big trunk that she thought about leaving, but just for a moment. Tommy, their farmhand, was still there. She hurried out, finding him weeding in the field. Can you come early tomorrow? She asked. Tommy shrugged. Don't see why not. I need a ride to the train station, and I'll have my trunk with me. Can you help me with that as well? Heather knew he'd do anything she told him to do. She paid him good wages to do so. Sure can. I'd like you to be here by 7. Heather's mother never woke until after 9, so there would be no problem with getting out before she realized what was happening. Heather went back to her room and carefully put most of her belongings into a large trunk, but she put a few things into a carpet bag. One change of clothes, a nightgown, the dress she was sewing, her hairbrush. Simple things she would need along the way and when she first arrived in Idaho. After packing, she pushed the trunk up against the wall in her room, where it would be hidden behind her open door, and then she went into the kitchen to heat the soup she'd made the previous evening. Once it was cooked, she went to her mother's room. "Mother, it's time for supper." Her mother rubbed her eyes. "Is it invalid food?" her mother asked. "It's the rest of the soup I made for supper last night. But I did pick some cherries and made a cherry pie to go with it." That was enough for her mother to sit up in bed. "I think I'm well enough for pie." "Not until after you've eaten some of the soup," Heather told her mother. It was hard having to be the responsible one between her mother and herself. While they ate, her mother asked who would sit with her while Heather went to church on Sunday. "I don't want just anyone," she said. "Not one of those demon horde Miller kids. I promise, none of the demon horde will come. You don't need anyone to sit with you. You'll be fine." Besides, Heather had no time to make that kind of arrangement. She'd leave a note on the table for her mother, and that was all. She wasn't going to keep being manipulated by her mother, who wasn't even ill. Her mother pouted, and Heather ignored it. When Heather put the cherry pie on the table, her mother perked right up. "Oh, that smells delicious. Who taught you to make such wonderful pies?" "Grandmother," Heather said, meaning her father's mother. Her other grandmother had nothing to do with Heather or her family. "She taught you well," her mother said, eating her first bite and smiling happily. "I could eat this for every meal." "Then you really would be sick." Heather was able to bite back the retort she wanted to make. "That wouldn't be good for you." After supper, Heather got her mother back to bed but didn't linger, even when her mother begged her to read to her. Why her mother couldn't read to herself was beyond Heather. She would have happily done as her mother needed for the rest of her life if she'd truly been ill, but knowing the truth made it difficult to tolerate staying with her. As soon as she closed her mother's door, Heather sat down at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil, quickly writing her mother a note. "Mother, the doctor says you are fine and more than capable of taking care of yourself. I have no desire to spend the rest of my life in servitude to your whims, so I am heading out on my own. Please don't look for me. I'm not anywhere you'll find me, and I think spending the years I have playing hostage to your imaginary illness have given me the right to be happy. Sincerely, Heather." She took the note into her room on the off chance her mother would emerge from her own room during the night. After the dishes were done, and everything was as neat as she could possibly leave it, she went into her bedroom and closed the door, and started to pin the different dress pieces together so she would be able to sew on the train. She set her alarm for 6 the following morning, planning to make her mother breakfast before she left. She still felt a little bit guilty about leaving, but not too much. She had a life to live. She made toast with butter and a bit of jam from her preserves the year before. When she finished, she dried her hands, put the note on the table, and she carried her trunk out and down the front steps, which was no easy task. But it was best her mother not know she was going. Heather was certain her mother would be able to talk her out of her elaborate plan. When Tommy arrived, he helped her put the trunk in the back of his wagon, and then he drove her to town. "Where are you going?" Heather smiled. "I'm off on an adventure." "One your mother doesn't know about?" he asked. "Yes. You'll want to let the doctor know I'm gone." "I will." At the train station, he again helped her with her trunk, and she purchased a ticket that would take her all the way to Clover Creek, Idaho. Idaho was one of the newer states, but she could easily find it on a map. She knew it had been part of what was then called Oregon Territory. And then the conductor called out, "All aboard." The words were magic to her ears, and she hurried to the train with her carpet bag over one shoulder. After finding a seat, she glanced out the window for one last glimpse of the only place she'd ever called home. She immediately took her dress pieces from her carpet bag and started stitching them together. Idle hands and all that. She would have work to do the whole way to Idaho, where she would begin a new life as a wife and hopefully one day be a mother. Why, she even looked forward to meeting her future mother-in-law. It would be glorious. Chapter 3. Next stop, Clover Creek, Idaho. Next stop, Clover Creek, Idaho, the conductor's voice rang out, waking Heather. She'd finished her dress just as it turned dark the previous night, and now it just needed to be ironed. Hopefully she would have time to do that soon. She gathered her carpet bag and stood, looking out the window at the beautiful valley she found herself in, with small mountains surrounding it. Well, she wasn't sure if they could be classified as small mountains or large hills, but it was one of those, and she liked the idea of mountains. She'd never been a person to do anything just to be healthful, but the idea of climbing one of those mountains was taking root in her mind. She wanted to do it. Perhaps Patrick would enjoy hiking. She would find out when she met him. When she stood to get off the train, she felt stiff in every bone of her body. She'd only been up to get water and to take care of her necessary business and to change trains since leaving Beckham. She wasn't sure she had any muscles left, but if she did, she would use them to get off the train and onto the platform. Hopefully, Patrick would be waiting for her. When she stepped off the train, she looked around, but there was no man looking like he was waiting for someone to arrive. Then a middle-aged woman appeared beside her. "Are you Heather?" Heather nodded at the woman who looked to be a bit older than her mother. "Mrs. O'Brien?" "Yes, that's me. Patrick is waiting in the wagon." "Oh, I have a trunk as well as my carpet bag." Heather looked at a large man who looked very intimidating at the top of the wagon waiting on the street. "Patrick." Mrs. O'Brien called. "You're needed." The man jumped down off the wagon and walked over to stand with his mother and Heather. He was huge. At least a foot taller than Heather's 5'2". "Yes, Mother?" Heather tried to hide a grin. He sounded like her when she was humoring her mother, but his voice was a wee bit deeper. "Your sweet bride has a trunk that needs to come home with us, and I believe it's there on the platform already. Would you be a dear?" Patrick shrugged, walked over, and lifted it onto one shoulder as if it weighed nothing. He put it into the back of the wagon, then helped his mother up into the seat. He grasped Heather around the waist and lifted her straight over the side of the wagon. She sat down on her trunk and waited as he got into the wagon. Heather was a bit uncomfortable riding that way, but it was better than the wagon bed, and that was the only other option. He drove them down to an intersection, where he made a left turn, and drove for a couple of minutes. Then he pulled off to the right side of the road to a small church. "This is a beautiful valley," Heather said as Patrick lifted her out of the wagon. On her feet, she looked all around her, just trying to take in the beautiful place. It was a little harder to breathe, but she'd heard that happened in high altitudes, so she thought nothing of it. He looked around, nodding. "I've always lived here, but the beauty strikes me every day." Heather was pleased. Her first interaction with her husband hadn't been too terribly painful. He led her and his mother into the small church, calling out for the pastor, who was sitting at the front, reading some notes. "Pastor Scott." "Hello, Mrs. O'Brien." "Patrick." "This is Heather," Patrick said in his deep rumbling voice. "She's here to marry me." Obviously, the pastor had been warned they were coming early, because it was barely past sunup and he was in the church waiting for them. He was an older man, looking to be well into his 70s. "Well, we should get to that then, shouldn't we?" The pastor seemed to see past Heather's appearance, which had to be truly disheveled. Her dress had dirt on it, and she felt as if she'd never be clean again. "Welcome to the Bear Lake Valley, Heather. I hope you enjoy it here." "It's a beautiful place," Heather said. I'm lucky that I'll be able to call it home." The elderly pastor went straight into the wedding ceremony, and Heather was surprised at how little time it took. She'd been to weddings before, and they'd always seemed to take a long time, but here she was, with a wedding that seemed to take less than 5 minutes. "You may kiss the bride." Heather looked at the huge man beside her who was now her husband and waited to see what he'd do. He leaned down and kissed her on the cheek and quickly returned to his full height. Looking at the pastor, he said, "Thank you, Pastor Scott. We'll be back on Sunday." And Heather and her new mother-in-law were led out of the church and to the wagon, where each was helped into it. After Patrick took his seat, he turned the wagon around and drove straight out of town. It wasn't terribly surprising that he lived out of town, given the fact that he was a rancher. They drove for what seemed to be about 15 minutes, and Heather wondered the entire time if her new husband was always succinct with his speech. He didn't seem to be willing to waste extra words on her. When he pulled into a yard, he helped the ladies down, hefted the trunk onto his shoulder, and walked toward the house. His mother hurried ahead of him to open the door for him, and he carried the trunk straight up the stairs as Heather watched him. "Should I follow him?" she whispered to Mrs. O'Brien. "I'll show you around later. We need to get some breakfast into you." "Well, into all of us really." Mrs. O'Brien led the way into the kitchen. "When we realized your train would be here so early, we decided to wait on breakfast until we were back here, and the wedding was over." "That makes sense," Heather said, digging in her carpet bag for her apron, and pulling it on over her dress. She did it out of habit, because at that moment, her dress was filthy and the apron over it was clean. "How can I help you?" Mrs. O'Brien smiled. "For now, sit at the table for a minute. You look like you're too tired to walk." Heather shook her head. "I've been sitting for days. Please give me a task so I can remain on my feet." "Well, I like that attitude for certain." Mrs. O'Brien pursed her lips. "Go ahead and butter the bread, and then we'll put it in the oven to toast it. I really prefer the taste of bread that's already been buttered before it's heated, don't you?" Heather opened her mouth to respond, but it only took a moment for her to realize that Mrs. O'Brien was used to talking to herself all day. "Patrick is out on the range most days. He has a dozen ranch hands who all take an hour for lunch, and while they eat, Patrick comes here. They see to themselves for breakfast and supper down at the bunkhouse. I think one of them cooks, and the others take turns cleaning, but I might be wrong about that." Patrick walked into the kitchen then, finding his new wife and his mother working together comfortably in the kitchen. "How long?" His mother shrugged. "About 20 minutes, give or take a few." "Why don't you go and unhitch the wagon and put the horses in the stable?" Patrick turned and did as he was told. "He doesn't say much," Heather said before his mother started talking again. She was finding it hard to get a word in edgewise. "Never has." "I'm not sure why." "Well, I guess his pa was rather quiet as well. I always feel like I'm having half a dozen conversations with myself, simply so I'll hear a voice throughout the day." Mrs. O'Brien shook her head as she whipped up some eggs for scrambled eggs. "Oh, and you need to call me Sally. Mrs. O'Brien was my mother-in-law, and I wasn't terribly fond of her." Heather wondered for a moment if it was time for her to talk, but Mrs. O'Brien started talking again almost immediately. "My family came here on the Oregon Trail. I'm sure you've heard stories about it. I was just a little girl, and the area was already starting to grow when my family got here. I thought it was the most beautiful place in the whole wide world, and I still think so most days." She put bacon into her skillet, and it sizzled immediately. "Some Sunday after church, you need to talk Patrick into driving you out to Bear Lake. It's so beautiful, but it's a long drive, so it'll be a trip that will last a whole day. Patrick won't take off any day but Sunday. Why, he wanted me to go into town and get you by myself, but I told him he needed to be there to meet his bride." "So, what does he do?" "He sits in the wagon while I meet you." I swear, the boy needs my prodding to do anything but work. Work he does on his own, but only because he loves his job so much. Does he work a lot of hours? Heather was shocked she got an entire sentence out before Sally started talking again. He does. Sun up to sundown every day but Sunday, and he only takes Sundays off because I make him take me to church, and while he's driving me, I remind him over and over that it's a sin to work on Sundays. I swear some days he doesn't even seem to know what I'm saying. Sally put the bacon onto a plate and then added the egg mixture to the bacon grease. Just a tip for cooking for my son, you need to make about 6 times what you think you should make. He eats more than any man I've ever met, but don't you worry. He never gains weight. He's just built like a bull, which is good, because there are days he all but wrestles them. Heather heard footsteps and turned to see Patrick there, holding a basket full of eggs and a pail of milk. "Let me take those," she said. She looked and saw an icebox, which she put the milk into, and she left the eggs on the counter in the basket. Sally nodded to Heather. "Set the table, child. If you can't find something, just dig through all my cabinets." She took the eggs out of the skillet and put them into a large bowl. Pulling the toast out of the oven, she stacked the pieces on a plate and put that on the table. Heather had the table set as everyone sat down. "Are you a coffee drinker?" Sally asked Heather. "It's hard to get coffee in these parts sometimes, because some people here believe that coffee is not only bad for you but anti-Christian. Now we don't believe that, but we've gotten used to not always having a pot of coffee in the mornings, even if we would prefer to have it. Isn't that so, Patrick?" Patrick nodded, bowing his head. Heather was happy to see her new husband was a praying man, and she lowered her head as well. His prayer was short and to the point. "Heavenly Father, thank you for this food. Thank you for sending me a pretty wife. In Jesus' name. Amen." Heather blushed, not sure she should be saying amen after that prayer. It did make her feel good that he thought she was pretty. They all passed the food around, fixing their plates. Heather was surprised at the sheer amount of food Patrick was able to fit onto his plate, and she found herself watching him eat, just to see if he was going to be able to finish it all. "Aren't you hungry?" Sally asked Heather. "Oh, yes, of course." Heather dug her fork into her eggs and took a bite. "They're good. So fluffy. I pride myself on my cooking. I'll show you everything you need to know." "I've been cooking for years," Heather said. Sally stopped with her fork halfway to her mouth. "You have?" Patrick said his wife didn't need to be able to cook in his letter, didn't he? "Yes, but that doesn't stop me from being able to do it. I've been cooking since I was 10. Did your mother not cook?" Sally asked. "She's been ill." Heather wasn't going to go into the whole story, but she wasn't going to lie about her past either. It was going to be a fine line to walk when she talked about her mother. "Oh, no. I'm so sorry to hear that. I'm sure she passed." Without waiting for a response, Sally kept going, and Heather was pleased she didn't have to explain that her mother was still alive. "I'll be your new mother, and we'll be as close as any mother and daughter you've ever seen." Heather wasn't sure what to say to that, so she just nodded. "Poor thing can't even talk about it," Sally said, shaking her head. Patrick was the same way when he lost his father. The two of them worked together every single day, and then one day his father was kicked by an ornery bull. His leg was broken, but it got gangrenous quick. He lost the leg and died from the blood loss. It was terrible. It sounds awful. I'm sorry for your loss. I know you are, Sally said, patting Heather's hand. Now Patrick oversees the entire ranch, and though he doesn't say much, I think he's happy not to have to tell anyone what he's thinking or what he wants to do. Now he just does what he wants with the ranch, and he's tripled the size of the herd in the 5 years since he's taken over. Heather peeked at Patrick, seeing that his plate was empty, and he was adding more. I suppose we'll have to make the most of our evenings together and get to know each other. Patrick shrugged, still shoveling more eggs onto his plate. Yes, I'll make sure the two of you have plenty of time alone together. I want grandbabies, and I'd like a whole house full of them. At Heather's blush, Sally laughed. I know what married people do when they're alone together. Why, you don't even need to worry about being quiet around me. I won't be bothered at all knowing you're working on the first of my grandchildren. Heather quickly changed the subject. Is Patrick your only son? He is. I had a daughter, but she died when she was only a few days old. It broke my heart, but I was happy to have my Patrick there to take my mind off my troubles. He was always such a good boy, weren't you, Patrick? Patrick shrugged and took a big bite out of the piece of toast in his hand. He walked all the way to the school in Clover Creek, and he got a good solid, 8th grade education. I couldn't be prouder of him. Chapter 4. Even though she was more tired than she could possibly express, Heather worked with her mother-in-law all through the day. She helped garden, cook, clean, and unpacked in the room she'd been told she'd share with Patrick. There were 3 other bedrooms, though why a family of 3 had ever needed a house that large, she didn't know. When she and Patrick had a moment alone to talk, she'd ask him if he wanted her to take a different room as they got to know one another. She truly hoped he wouldn't mind that. She was a farm girl, and she understood the birds and the bees, but given his sheer size, she wasn't sure if he would crush her. For supper, her mother-in-law asked her if she would fix something with the chicken she'd put on the counter. Heather looked at it, then looked through the cabinets to see what was there for her to work with. She decided to make chicken and dumplings, something that had been a favorite of hers, and she quickly started boiling the chicken. While it boiled, she rolled out dough and used a knife to make the small cuts she wanted. While Sally was working in the garden, Heather put together the meal, wishing she had time to make some bread to go with it. There were green beans fresh from the garden that she and Sally had picked earlier that day, and she quickly snapped them into a pot of boiling water, adding just a slice of bacon to flavor them. By the time Sally came back in the house with tomatoes, the house smelled of chicken and dumplings. Oh, whatever it is you're making, you're going to have to teach me that receipt. Heather turned with a smile on her face. It's just chicken and dumplings. One of the first dishes I learned to make, and I must say, it's one of my favorites. I'm sure Patrick is going to walk into this house, throw himself at your feet, and beg you to have his babies. Sally looked her up and down. How old are you anyway? Heather realized she was going to have to get used to the things her mother-in-law said, even though they were slightly off color. I'm 27. Sally put a hand on either side of Heather's hips, frowning a little. I'd like to see your hips just a little wider for you to bear babies. Did your mother have trouble birthing you? Not at all. Or not so she'd heard anyway. But her mother had been 14 when she was born, so she really had no idea of how things should have been, and no one had ever told her otherwise. Well, that's a relief. Is she built like you? Heather just nodded. I have the green beans almost done as well as the chicken and dumplings. What time should we expect Patrick for supper? Sally laughed. Not comfortable with that topic? Think nothing of it. We'll talk about Patrick for a minute. Did you know that boy was over 10 pounds when he was born? Now, I'm a bigger woman than you are, which I'm sure you've noticed. I'm tall and I have wide hips. Birthing just wasn't a problem for me. I just never got pregnant again after my little girl, Beulah. I'm sorry to hear that, Heather said, not sure what the older woman wanted her to say. Me too. I always wanted a dozen or more children, and it just didn't happen for me. Now that Patrick is grown and his father is gone, I worry that I've already lived the best parts of my life. Sally looked at the clock on the wall. Oh, my. It's starting to get dark. Patrick should be here any minute. I'll go out and see to milking the cow. I don't mind milking, Heather said, wondering how the woman would be able to fit on a milking stool without falling off. She was truly a large woman, though it seemed like that was a good thing to Heather. Her grandmother had been large, and she'd given the best hugs in the world. No need. You finish up supper. Heather was adding just a touch of black pepper into the chicken and dumplings when she heard footsteps behind her. You already finished with the milking, she asked, without even turning around. I didn't do the milking, a deep voice said from behind her. Heather jumped, bumping her hand against the pot the chicken and dumplings were in. Oh. Patrick grabbed her burned hand, walked to the sink, and started pumping water over it. Hold it there. It'll help the burn. Thank you, she said, looking at him, still standing there holding her by the wrist. I hope Ma didn't say anything to scare you away. She talks a lot. Heather laughed, ignoring the pain in her hand. That's an understatement. His lips twitched. Well, you're still here. That's good. I'm not afraid. I think we're going to do well together. Your mother and I, that is. I don't know you well enough to even hazard a guess. She looked down at her hand, realizing they were alone for the moment. Do you want me to unpack my things in your room or one of the spare rooms? Well, I want you in my room. He looked almost offended that she'd asked. I just meant for a week or two as we get to know each other. He shook his head. No, you're staying in my room. All right. That's where I unpacked, but then I wasn't sure, so I asked. You don't want to go back to Massachusetts? He asked. Of course not. Why would I? I'm big. Scary to some. Heather blinked a couple of times. Have other girls been afraid of you? He nodded. Well, I'm not other girls. She pulled her hand out from under the water. I think that's enough. It barely hurts now. Supper smells good, he said, obviously trying to figure out what to say to his wife. It's chicken and dumplings with green beans fresh from the garden. Do you like chicken and dumplings? Never had 'em. Well, then you're in for a treat. This is my favorite meal and the first one I learned to cook. Patrick looked into the pot. Is it ready? Heather smiled, nodding. It is. I'll set the table, and as soon as your ma is done milking the cow, we'll have supper. I like to eat. His words were simple, but she couldn't help but smile. I noticed at breakfast. He smiled. Good. While Heather set the table, he stood in the middle of the kitchen watching her, like he'd never seen a woman before. She had to keep walking around him, but it didn't bother her. When Sally came back inside, it was to find her son and daughter-in-law in the kitchen together. I hope you two are cozying up and getting to know each other, she said. Heather nodded. I burned my hand, and Patrick helped me get it under cold water. Did you get the cattle rounded up from the Applegates' land? Sally asked. Patrick nodded. Took all day. I wondered why you weren't here for lunch today. Had to get the cattle. Well, we missed you. I'll heat up what we fixed for lunch tomorrow. We missed you, Sally said. She noticed that Heather had gotten all the food on the table. Let's eat. Patrick sat in his chair, waiting for the women to join him. As soon as the prayer was over, he started to fill his plate, and he filled it just as full as he had that morning. I would have made fresh bread to go with this, but there just wasn't time today. In fact, Heather was still wearing her dirty clothes from the train. She'd planned to be changed before he arrived, but there had been little time. Patrick cleaned his plate before complimenting Heather on her cooking. Food's good. Thank you. Sally looked back and forth between them, a huge smile on her face. I'm so happy you two are getting along so well. Heather felt like she was a bug in a jar, being watched at everything she did. I think we're both determined to make our marriage work, Heather said, wishing her mother-in-law would drop the subject. I certainly hope so, Sally said. I want at least a dozen grandbabies, unless your hips are too narrow, and then I don't know what we'll do. Patrick barely looked up from his plate to see Heather looking uncomfortable. Leave her alone, Ma. It was the first time Heather had really heard him say anything that wasn't in direct answer to something else. And he was defending her. It was a good thing. Sally sighed, looking a bit deflated. All right. This really is good, Heather. I would love the receipt when you have the time to write it out for me. Heather smiled. I'll do that later. She was getting tired. Would it be a problem if I took a bath after I finished up the dishes tonight? Sally shook her head. Of course not. You take your bath while I do the dishes. You've traveled a long way to give me grandbabies. Ma. It was only one word, but it was said with a great deal of emotion. All right. Yes, take a bath tonight. I will see to the dishes. I know you're tired. Thank you, Heather said, thrilled that her husband was trying to shut down his mother's talk of them reproducing. Her own mother had never once mentioned such a thing to her, and her mother-in-law had more times in one day than Heather could count. For the rest of the meal, the talk was about how the ranch was doing, and if Patrick thought they'd lost any of the cattle to the Applegates. I don't think so, Ma. And if the Applegates find our cattle in among theirs, they'll make sure to get them back to me. That's the kind of people they are. That's true. How's old man Applegate doing? Is his son still running the ranch? Sally asked. Patrick nodded. He's having trouble with his arthritis, but seems okay. I'll have to talk to him about it in church this week, Sally said. I wonder if he's seen Dr. Bentley? I don't know, Ma. I can ask him myself. You are not very good at asking the questions I want answers to anyway. He never gets a chance to speak. Heather kept her thoughts to herself. She was enjoying watching how Patrick and his mother got on together. It was very different than how she and her mother had been. For an instant, but only an instant, Heather felt guilty for the way she'd left Beckham. Yes, it had been the only way she would ever escape from her controlling mother, but it hadn't been particularly kind. After supper, Heather cleared the table while Sally boiled the water for the dishes. As soon as the table had been wiped clean, Heather was sent into the bathroom. After staring at the real bathtub for a moment, she decided she didn't want to take the time to learn to use the contraption. Instead, she wet a washcloth and gave herself a sponge bath, planning to ask Sally how to use the tub the following day. Her hair would need to be washed then, but for tonight, she could just braid it. After cleaning herself up as best she could, she went into the kitchen. I think I need to turn in, she said. I'm just too tired to stay awake. Sally nodded. Patrick will be up in a minute. He goes to bed early. Heather nodded, hoping against hope that Patrick would let her wait a day or two before performing her wifely duties. She was just too tired. At the top of the stairs, she went into his room, quickly changing into her nightgown and climbing into the oversized bed. She was sure Patrick had built the bed himself based on the sheer size of it. No one else needed a bed quite that big. Well, not that she knew of anyway. By the time Patrick reached the top of the stairs, Heather was already asleep. He looked at her sleeping so soundly on one side, facing the wall. Instead of waking her, he silently got undressed and joined her in the bed. He lay on his own side, wrapping himself around his pretty little wife. As he closed his eyes, he thought about just how much he would like to be doing something with her other than sleeping that night, but he wasn't about to wake her. No, she'd made a long journey, and then worked with his mother all day. He could see that the work done could never have been managed by his mother alone. Resting his head on the pillow with hers, her hair tickling his cheek, he fell asleep, thinking about how wonderful this marriage was going to be. If only his ma would keep her nose where it belonged. Heather woke when he rested his head on the pillow with hers. She half expected him to wake her and at least try to have a wedding night, but he didn't. She could hear his even breathing, and it seemed that he'd gone to sleep. He was sleeping holding her, as if she was something precious he'd just found. Almost like a child held a doll or another object that was special. It felt good to be someone's special object. As she drifted back to sleep, she realized that though Patrick didn't say much, he was strong and kind. She had made the right choice going all the way to Clover Creek, Idaho, to marry a stranger. Even if his mother was half crazy and talked too much. During the night, she rolled toward him, snuggling against the heat of his body. Never in her life had she slept with someone, and she couldn't believe how comforted she felt by him. He was a good man, and she hadn't made a mistake after all. Chapter 5. Heather woke the following morning to see Patrick propped on one elbow and watching her sleep. Her eyes slowly opened, and she smiled at him. "Good morning. I'm sorry I fell asleep so quickly last night." She hoped he wasn't angry that she'd robbed him of his wedding night. He shook his head. "No reason to be. I enjoyed holding you through the night." "I think I enjoyed it too. I woke up a few times, realized where I was, and fell right back to sleep. I feel safe in your arms." She couldn't fathom why she felt so safe with him, but she really did. He was a good man. He would have to be to put up with the way his mother didn't let him get a word in edgewise. Patrick watched her for a moment. "We must get up soon. I can already hear Mother stirring, but may I kiss you first?" His voice was timid, as if he was afraid she would refuse him his simple request. Heather nodded. "I'm your wife. Of course, you may kiss me." He reached out with his big hands and pulled her toward him, his lips going to hers. It was a gentle kiss, almost as if he was welcoming her to his life there. After the kiss, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, and it was then she realized he wasn't wearing anything. Heather rolled to her back and looked straight up at the ceiling rather than watching him in his state of undress. "Do you always sleep without a nightshirt?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "I do in the summer. It's too hot to care too much about what I wear to bed." Heather was surprised. "I thought it was cold last night." "At home, it's almost as hot during the day as it is at night." "I'm dressed now. You can look." Turning toward him, Heather saw that his face was filled with amusement. She felt as if she'd learned more about him in the few minutes since she'd woken than she had in the entire previous day. "What is your plan for the day?" she asked. "I have to finish the repairs to the barn I was making before the cattle ran off." He shook his head. "I love that I live in a place where we can just let our cattle roam free, but they do tend to get into mischief when left unsupervised." She laughed. "You make them sound like small children." "It feels that way at times." He stood there, watching her as she got out of bed, pulling her nightgown down from where it had ridden up, showing a large area of her thigh. "I hope you won't fall asleep so quickly tonight." When standing, she didn't come up to his shoulder, and it made her feel tiny and delicate. "I will try to stay awake a little longer. I didn't get much sleep on the train." They were calling out stops the entire time. All through the night. "I wouldn't have slept either." He leaned down and kissed her once more. "I'm not sure how much I can kiss you while standing, it's going to hurt my back. I'll have to save that for when we're in bed together." Heather's face was red as he shut the door behind him. As soon as she heard his footsteps on the stairs, she dressed and brushed her hair, putting it into a bun quickly. Once downstairs, she took her apron from the hook where it hung beside his mother's and put it on. "Good morning, Sally," she said, seeing her new mother-in-law at the stove, flipping pancakes. "What can I do to help?" "Set the table for me. I'm just doing pancakes this morning, so it's mostly a one-woman job." Sally smiled at her. "Maybe another morning, I can sleep a little later, and you can put breakfast on. I'd be happy to do that any time you'd like. We are going to have to get creative for lunch today. I usually make enough for lunch the following day, but we ate all your chicken and dumplings last night. They were delicious. Perhaps we can bake bread this morning and make sandwiches? Heather suggested. It was something she often did for lunch with her mother if there was nothing left from the night before. Sally grinned. You bake the bread, and I'll fry up the bacon to go on it. Do you like bacon? I don't believe there is a person who has tried bacon that doesn't like it, Heather said with a smile. That sounds like a delicious lunch. How many loaves of bread should I make? If that's what we're having for lunch, I'd make at least 8. Then we'll have some with supper tonight, and some more for breakfast tomorrow. Patrick will eat at least a loaf and a half on his own, if he's not too hungry. I've seen him eat 3. Heather sighed. Is that what made him grow so tall? I feel like I'm a child beside him. Sally laughed. I'm tall, and his father was tall. Not as tall as Patrick, but almost. As I got older, I've widened out a bit, but Patrick is still as lean as ever. She scooped 4 pancakes out of the pan and poured 4 more. Will you eat more than 4 pancakes? Heather looked at the size of the pancakes her mother-in-law had made. I won't eat more than one of that size. I'll still make 4. Then you can share what you have left with Patrick. How many will he eat? Heather asked, eyes wide. I always make him 16, but sometimes he wants more than that. Sally shrugged. I keep saying he's a growing boy. Did his father eat as much as he does? No, but he ate a lot. I thought I'd never be able to take a break from cooking. I'm glad you're here to at least help with it. Sally sighed. I love my boy, but the amount of food he goes through would keep a full-time cook busy. Patrick opened the door then, bringing in a pail of milk and a basket of eggs. I could take over gathering the eggs or milking the cow or both, Heather suggested. I think I'd do better on that tiny stool than Patrick does. He grinned. I am a little large for it. His mother laughed from the kitchen. You are much too big for everything, she said. Heather smiled at him. You are a little bit bigger than the average bear. He chuckled, taking the eggs and milk into the kitchen. Is breakfast ready yet, Ma? Just about. Go sit and I'll have it out to you in a moment. Sally looked at Heather. You drink coffee? Heather shook her head. I usually just drink milk for breakfast. I'll get it. Once they were all seated and had said their prayer, Sally began talking between bites of food. I hope you two had a nice wedding night. I'm going to start counting now, hoping there will be a grandbaby in exactly 9 months. My grandbaby would be the most loved child in the world. I cannot imagine what would make me feel more blessed. Patrick looked at his mother. Ma, stop. Sally sighed, looking down at her plate. I want to imagine my grandchildren. Heather frowned. She didn't want to hear his mother constantly talking about her and Patrick procreating, but she also didn't want her to feel like she couldn't think about the grandchildren she would have. Why don't you start making little things for the baby to wear and blankets for him or her? Then you can think about the baby, and still not make us feel like we need to spend every moment in bed trying to make one for you? Patrick bit his lips to keep from cracking a smile. He reached under the table and took Heather's hand, squeezing it. I think that's a wonderful idea, Ma. Don't think I won't. Sally looked as if she had a new purpose in life. I'm going to go to Jensen's Mercantile and get myself some fabric for a baby quilt today. Take Heather with you. Get some fabric for a new dress or 2 for her. Heather shook her head. I made a new dress on the train. I don't need another new dress. Ma, get Heather some fabric. I will. I've never known you to not want to spend money. Patrick shook his head. If I'd let her, she'd buy out the store. Sally gave him an admonishing glance. I think I should make some booties, a couple of gowns, a quilt, oh, and so many more things. I can't wait until I can hold him or her in my arms, whenever you two get around to making him, of course. Heather wanted to shake her head. Sally was already talking about them making a baby again. She hadn't even stopped for a full 5 minutes. Her eyes met Patrick's, and she could see the amusement in them, and she started laughing. She had a feeling it would do no good to talk to Sally again. The woman wanted grandchildren, and she was not going to be silent about the matter until Heather was pregnant. Is there anything you need from the store, Patrick? Heather asked. He seemed to think about it for a moment before shaking his head. Not today. The store is only a 10-minute drive from here, Sally said. If you'll hitch up the wagon for me before going out on the range, I'd appreciate it. At Patrick's nod, she continued, I'll stock up on supplies while we're there. With as difficult as things are to get in the winter around here, I tend to keep a stockpile of food to use throughout the year. I'm lower on flour than I like to be, so I'll be certain to get a couple of 50-pound bags. Too bad potatoes aren't in season yet. The potatoes that come from Idaho dirt are the best potatoes in the world. Throughout the rest of the meal, Sally chattered on about what she'd get at the store and how she liked to do things around the ranch, but Heather mostly tuned her out, feeling a little closer to her husband. He was obviously just as bemused by his mother's constant talking as she was. When Patrick got up after the meal, he said, I'll go and hitch up the team. Heather hurried after him to the door. Perhaps we could walk alone tonight. It would be nice to talk to you alone for a while. He chuckled. It would at that. Bring a couple of baskets, and we'll go pick some huckleberries. Huckleberries? She asked. I've never tried them. They make a wonderful pie, he said, winking at her. With that, he hurried out to the stable to hitch up the team, and she returned to the table to help with the cleanup. Sally grinned at her when she came back from the door. You're starting to like my boy there, aren't you? Heather nodded. He's easy to like. Hopefully that would be the most intrusive thing his mother said all day. She said a silent prayer that there would be no more probing questions. It was hard to know how to answer to satisfy her but not tell her anything. Well, I sure hope he was gentle on your wedding night. My boy is a bit like a bull in a china shop at times. Sally shook her head, piling plates atop one another to carry them into the kitchen. Why, once at church, he leaned back in the pew, and his legs are so strong, the entire pew leaned backward. There were squeals heard right in the middle of the pastor's sermon. He was embarrassed, but his pa and I just laughed. Before we go to town, would you show me how to use the bathtub? I just washed with a cloth last night and didn't bathe. I feel disgusting. Heather was so looking forward to learning how to use the built-in bathtub. She'd never had one at her disposal. Oh, of course. After they finished the breakfast dishes, Heather mixed the dough for their bread, took a bath, and then they headed into town, with Heather wearing her new dress for the first time. The Mercantile wasn't a big store at all, but it had what they needed to purchase. Sally and Heather chose different fabrics for all the projects they had in mind. I'd like to make curtains for our bedroom, Heather said, looking through the fabrics. Do you think Patrick would mind? Sally shook her head. Of course not. I think at this point, the man would strip naked and swim across Bear Lake in the middle of winter if it would make you happy. A voice behind Sally said, Patrick? Heather turned to look at the woman who'd asked the question. Do you know Patrick? Yes, of course I do. I've been in this town since its inception. The woman held her hand out to Heather. I'm Margaret Pruitt. I run the boarding house here in town. Well, my daughter, granddaughter, and I run it together. I'm not moving as well as I once was. The woman was obviously around 80 years old. It's so nice to meet you. I'm Heather O'Brien. I married Patrick yesterday. Mrs. Pruitt smiled. That's wonderful. Patrick is a good man. You'll have to come and see me for tea one day. You'll bring her, won't you, Sally? I'd love to, Margaret. You know I enjoy spending time with you and those fabulous cookies you make. I always have some ready to be served. Come soon. Mrs. Pruitt patted Heather's arm and turned away. She's nice, Heather said to Sally. She really is. She was on the wagon train that settled here back in 1852. There's a whole community of people from that train, and then others of us settled in around them. I feel so much love in this place. I wouldn't move for the world. When they checked out, the man, Amos Jensen, smiled at Sally. Are you having a good day, Mrs. O'Brien? Yes, a perfectly wonderful day, Sally said. This is my new daughter-in-law, Heather. It's nice to meet you, Mrs. O'Brien, the man said, smiling. My family has been here since the valley was first settled. You'll feel at home here in no time. After they'd paid for their purchases, Amos carried the items out to their wagon himself. When is that grandfather of yours going to retire? Sally asked. Amos laughed. I think my grandpa is going to be a blacksmith until he falls over. That wouldn't surprise me a lick. Sally said, climbing over the wagon wheel into the wagon seat and picking up the leads. Heather climbed up as well and sat beside her new mother-in-law. It was nice meeting you, she said to Amos. And you? Amos said. On the way back to the ranch, Sally told stories about the town, pointing out different businesses as they drove down the main street. I really think I'm going to be happy here, Heather said, all at once feeling the weight of the years of caring for her mother falling off her shoulders. Clover Creek was her home.